Hi, I'm Dwayne Brown. Tonight on KPBS Evening Edition, congressional candidate Carl DeMaio responds to new charges of sexual harassment from another former campaign staffer. Also tonight, we'll look at one of the hottest races in the North County. It's a story of bankruptcies, lawsuits, and a lot of chicken manure.
You've probably been down the internet rabbit hole a few times, but when does an online binge turn into an addiction? I'm Peggy Pico with the answer from a local doctor who treated one of the first patients diagnosed with internet addiction. But first, we'll have an up-to-date look at the election races and why they're important.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for joining us. Just hours before Tuesday's election in the tight race for San Diego's 52nd district seat, a second former staffer from Carl DeMaio's congressional campaign is accusing him of sexual harassment. KPBS reporter Claire Trageser spoke with him over the weekend and joins us now. A warning, though, her report contains some graphic content. Claire, who's making these allegations and what are they saying?
It's Justin Harper. He's 25 years old and a Navy veteran. He began interning for the DeMaio campaign in February and then got a paid position making phone calls and knocking on doors to ask voters for their support. On July 10th, Harper says he returned to the campaign office after an afternoon of working for the campaign. He told me what happened over the phone. Here's what he said.
I was at the urinal and he went from the stall that was closest to the urinal and was just kind of standing there hovering. And then I turned around and I realized it was Carl, and he just had his pants up, but the fly was undone and he had his hand over his genitals, or not over, so grasping.
What happened next?
He quit and moved to Ohio. He says he wanted to get away from everyone on the DeMaio campaign.
How has the DeMaio camp responded?
Yesterday, his campaign spokesman issued a statement calling these allegations, quote, false smears. Today, DeMaio held a news conference, and here's what he had to say there.
At every turn, Scott Peters has been caught promoting, orchestrating, and coordinating this nasty, false, despicable smears against me.
And how has Scott Peters responded to this?
Well, yesterday the Peters campaign declined to comment on the story, but since DeMaio has begun saying Peters is behind the accusations, that's changed. Today at a news conference, Peters had this to say.
The one thing Carl's trying to do is deflect attention away from the fact that these are allegations made by members of his own staff. They're serious allegations.
KPBS reporter Claire Trageser. Voters will be heading to the polls tomorrow. Peggy Pico has a preview.
Joining me with a look ahead to the election are my guests, Carl Luna, political science professor at Mesa College, and Vince Vasquez, senior policy analyst with National University System Institute for Policy Research. Welcome back.
Good to be with you.
Now, Carl, the 52nd congressional race, this is one of 5 in the nation that's considered a major race to really watch closely. Incumbent Democrat Scott Peters defending a seat against challenger Republican Carl DeMaio. What makes this an important race?
The money that's going into it. I mean, bottom line, whoever comes out victorious will not change the balance of power in the House. And nothing's going to get done on the national stage between now and 2016. You spend $10 million in this district because you can. There'll be some Citizens United. There's a lot of money flowing around out there, and you spend it to see what works, how you can spend it, and channel the money into the race. If you're going to spend $10 million this year, in 2016 they'll spend $15 million, and nationally you're going to spend $10 billion to $15 billion on the campaign. So this is a tryout for the big leagues.
Do you still anticipate that this 52nd district race will be close? And if so, when might we know who the winner would be?
Well, it's going to be a close race. All the polls show that, and you've got all these different dynamics: incumbent versus Republican in a strong Republican year, allegations circling around the candidates and all. But bottom line, get yourself a good night's sleep on Tuesday night. If you find out at 6 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning who's in that seat, it's not going to be changing the life of the planet.
Well, and let's talk about this because, Vince, I know you've done some analysis of the 52nd district race. What's trending right now?
So what we've looked at is the early absentee ballot count. And for the last few weeks, Republican ballots have been the largest percentage of those ballots that have been returned, about 42 to 43% on average. And the voters have generally been older. About 68 to 72% have been 55 years or older. So we know for a fact that this actually benefits Carl DeMaio. We have a lower voter turnout election this time around, and clearly he has an edge coming into Election Day.
How much lower?
So what we expected was originally 42 to 46%, a little bit closer to almost half of the electorate, but we're probably expecting somewhere in the neighborhood of 34 to 38% voter turnout overall in the county. And that's actually a 30-year low here in San Diego County.
And so who benefits from that more? As you were saying, would the Republicans then tend to benefit more from that?
Here in San Diego, it's Republicans on the ballot who are benefiting.
Well, Carl, another important race in San Diego is up in Claremont, Kearny Mesa, and kind of moving north from there, District 6, where the race between Chris Cate, the Republican, against Democrat Carol Kim could actually end up in the council's changing the council's ability to sort of veto the mayors. So tell us about why that's important, and is it realistic that you think that'll happen?
Well, this is the legacy of our late great mayor who had to resign, triggering a special election, and Kevin Faulkner then became mayor, freeing up his seat to be appointed by the council, giving you a fluke 6-3 Democratic majority, which is veto proof. The Mayor Faulkner vetoes, they can overturn it. This race goes to Mr. Cates. It goes back to a 5-4 Democratic majority, but Kevin Faulkner's veto still matters, and it makes the mayor more relevant going into the 2016 election.
Any thoughts on where that's leading?
Well, one would have thought coming out of June that Mr. Cates had like 47-48% of the vote. His yardage to touchdown was much smaller that he had to accomplish than Carol Kim, but it would seem that she's been closing the gap. This could be an exciting race.
And Vince, you've actually called this election, aside from the San Diego city politics, of this sort of the election of mayors. I understand that from Chula Vista to Escondido, these are kind of some contentious races. Do you think that because of these mayoral elections in these cities that it'll increase voter turnout?
It will, certainly. And anytime studies have shown where you have a competitive election and voters are aware of a competitive election, they're more likely to cast a ballot. So I think that's what we have here in the case, especially with National City. In Escondido, you have a larger Latino electorate that's growing, a Democratic electorate that's growing, that's making that race more competitive.
And I was going to ask you, any ideas as far as how that's trending with Olga Diaz versus Sam Abed?
So I think Sam has really clearly an advantage here. In a low voter turnout election, Republicans are going to be coming out in full force in Escondido, as they are throughout the county. But I think long term, you're going to see a shift to more Democratic candidates getting elected and more Latino candidates getting elected.
Do you agree with that, Carl?
San Diego as a county is purpling, and in the city of San Diego, it's turning pretty blue. So, yeah, that's the long-term trend, and it's the problem in San Diego, the Republican Party nationally. How do you replace an aging electorate that's dying off?
All right, Carl Luna and Vince Vasquez, thanks very much. And I want to let folks know that you can get interactive election coverage at our website, kpbs.org/election, and we'll also have complete coverage tomorrow night on KPBS Evening Edition.
Well, the future of a former golf course may seem like a skippable item on Tuesday's ballot, but add a history of bankruptcies, lawsuits by the dozens, and truckloads of chicken manure, and you've got Measure H. It's one of the hottest issues for Escondido voters. KPBS reporter Jill Repp-Logel has the story.
Crystal Vermillion and Sue Bueller have been spending a lot of time lately on this street corner in northwestern Escondido, campaigning against Prop H, or Measure H as it's technically called. Measure H asks Escondido voters to decide whether or not to allow a large housing development on a defunct golf course near where Vermillion and Bueller are campaigning.
We moved here because it was a quiet, open space community. And that's why we feel so passionate about it. We want to preserve it.
If passed, Measure H would allow the owner of the former Escondido Country Club to build up to 430 single-family homes on the fairways. The plan also includes a community center, an Olympic-sized pool, parks, and trails. But opponents of the plan are not impressed.
they're going to put 55 houses there, according to the specific plan that's on the ballot.
Pat Hunter looks down on one of the fairways from her backyard. She's lived in the neighborhood for 10 years.
But it's the perfect place to live for a senior. It's handy. It's a good, safe neighborhood. It was quiet. And frankly, the golf course and the country club was a huge plus for me, for a social outlet, even though I wasn't planning to be a member or golf.
Many neighbors in the country club area are nostalgic for the lush green golf course that once was. One resident posted this slideshow of the club's glory days on YouTube. But it seems not many residents actually belonged to the country club, and its finances have long been wobbly. By the time developer Michael Schlesinger bought the club in 2012, it was in its third bankruptcy. Schlesinger says he bought the land knowing it was zoned for housing, but he first met with the country club members to see if the club had any future as a golf course.
Can we raise dues? Can we increase membership? Can we invest millions of dollars? And all the routes that we took, mostly because of the competitive landscape of golf, we just determined it wasn't economically viable. There wasn't a demand for golf in this area, and the community had never supported this golf course.
In April of last year, Schlesinger closed the country club, fenced off the course, and stopped watering the fairways. That's when the battle began. Local homeowners launched a campaign to get the golf course designated as permanent open space. The Escondido City Council adopted the initiative unanimously last year. Schlesinger then sued the city, saying its decision to rezone the golf course as open space severely decreased the value of his property. That lawsuit is ongoing. Schlesinger also filed 24 lawsuits against homeowners living around the golf course for walls and decks that encroached upon the property. Residents say the lawsuits were retaliation for the open space initiative. Schlesinger says he was just asserting his property rights.
And it comes off as we're suing our neighbors, but it was really sort of setting the boundary. And many of the encroachments, I mean, if you had a neighbor who built a wall through your property, I'm assuming that you would do something about it.
And then there was the chicken manure incident.
In Escondido community's outrage is growing over a stinking problem. 10 News reporter Maria Arcega-Dunn spoke to one homeowner who says that he was forced to leave after raw chicken manure was dumped on the golf course behind his home.
The San Diego Air Pollution Control District cited Schlesinger for spreading the manure. He says it was fertilizer. Neighbors think it was another act of revenge. And now we come to Measure H. It would essentially undo last year's open space initiative and make the developer's plan for the former golf course the city's plan. Despite the bad blood between Schlesinger's team and some members of the community, the developer says he's listened to neighbors' concerns about traffic, water use, and the desire for open space and amenities.
And the great thing about the specific plan is it has incredible flexibility. It's basically just a box to design the future of the property. It's up to 430 homes.
If Measure H passes, the development would still have to go through a city approval process, including environmental reviews. Many of those opposed to Measure H have come to terms with the likelihood that the golf course won't be coming back, but they want to negotiate with the developer on their terms, not his.
I hope that we will defeat H and that he or his builders, whomever they might be, will sit down in a reasonable fashion with members of this community and come to build a benefit to this community, which is not only a highly saleable product for the builder and the developer, but something that is, appropriate for the neighborhood and complementary to the neighborhood.
Whatever happens on November 4th, it's likely to be just one more chapter in this ongoing land use saga. Jill Replogle, KPBS News.
Video journalist Nick McVicker helped produce that story. You can find all of our election coverage and our online voter guide at kpbs.org/election. And of course, join us tomorrow night for the results and expert analysis. Our coverage begins after the polls close at 8 with updates from 8 until 11 on KPBS radio and right here on television. Then join us at 11 for a half-hour news special. We'll have the latest from Election Central downtown, all simulcast on KPBS radio and TV tomorrow night, November 4th. The public broadcasting family has lost one of its own today. Car Talk host Tom Magliozzi, has died. Tom and his brother Ray, you probably remember them together, hosted the weekend show on NPR for more than 30 years, doling out a lot of humor along with their automotive advice. Tom Magliozzi was 77. A Marine reservist who spent nearly 8 months in a Mexico prison is home tonight in Florida. Andrew Tamaresi was freed Friday night by a Mexican judge because of his mental state. Tamaresi fought in Afghanistan and suffers from PTSD. He was jailed for crossing the Tijuana border with loaded guns. Tamaresi says he took a wrong turn. The case led U.S. politicians to bring intense pressure on Mexico to release him because they had no way to treat his symptoms. No jail time for former state senator Rod Wright because of jail overcrowding in Los Angeles. Wright turned himself in Friday night to begin a 90-day sentence for fraud and perjury. The L.A. County Sheriff's Department released him about an hour later. The department says there was no special treatment. They say his crime wasn't violent and he had no prior convictions. A judge says a San Diego man accused of killing 3 people, including 2 in a parking lot in Mission Valley on Christmas Eve, is not mentally competent to stand trial. Carlo Mercado doesn't understand the charges against him, the judge says, and will spend time in a state mental hospital until he does. He's accused of shooting Ilona Flint, her fiancé Gianni Belvedere, and his brother Salvador. The motive for the killings is unclear. Mercado was linked to the case by DNA evidence found near one of the bodies. Federal investigators have been combing through the wreckage of an experimental spaceship in the Mojave Desert. They say Virgin Galactic Spaceship 2 broke apart in flight because a device on the craft was deployed too soon. The co-pilot was killed in the crash and the pilot was badly injured. Imagine going a day, a week, or more without using the internet. That's what one San Diego man had to do to break his addiction. Peggy Pico explains.
The Navy serviceman is one of the first in the country to be diagnosed and treated for internet addiction involving Google Glass. Joining me to talk about the emerging diagnosis and treatment is my guest, Dr. Andrew Doan, Chief of Addictions and Resilience Research at Naval Medical Center San Diego, who is treating the patient. It's an online addiction. Welcome, Dr. Doan.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the American Psychiatric Association does not actually recognize in the current DSM, the Manual for Mental Health Issues, they don't recognize internet addiction. How do you define internet addiction then?
That's correct. But they have recognized internet gaming disorder and that they have now wanted more research in that area. With internet addiction, the way you define it is that if someone is so preoccupied with the internet that affects their daily function and becomes dysfunctional, that then becomes an addictive behavior.
So it interferes with their work or their daily living activities.
Absolutely. And sleep deprivation, relationships, performance at work, school.
How did this diagnosis for this particular patient, how was that made? Because I understand he was also being treated for another addiction.
Yes, the service member was being treated for alcohol addiction in a 35-day residential treatment center. However, in that 35-day period, we take away all technology. And so he kept on tapping the side of his face when we asked him questions. And he shared with us that the craving for the Google Glass was greater than the craving for alcohol. And he felt argumentative, he felt frustration and anxiety when people asked him to be without his Google Glass.
Now, what was he consuming online, and would that make a difference as to deciding whether it's an addiction or not?
Well, not necessarily, because there's people who love to read news all the time, or maybe trade stocks during the day. So I'm forming a term called digital potency. So there's things that are less digital potent, like let's say email and PowerPoint and Excel spreadsheets, right? It's hard to abuse those things. But there are things like gaming and internet websites and images that people would like to look at all the time that are more pleasing and more neuroendocrine arousal.
Well, and this leads me to the next question, because a lot of us have gone down that internet rabbit hole where you just can't seem to let go of this particular thread. So what's the difference between an internet binge and an addiction?
That's a great question. So people wouldn't abuse anything unless it was pleasurable. But when people binge, it's because it is pleasurable. But when they binge, now it causes dysfunction in their relationships. Now grades are dropping, their work is suffering, they're not sleeping well, or they feel like they can't cut back. They're agitated and they're frustrated. Those are signs and symptoms of a dysfunctional behavior associated with that addictive problem.
How did you treat this particular case of internet addiction?
So with all addictions, it starts with first education. So educating the patient on the problem so that they can actually make life modifications, as well as just unplugging them from the device. So during the 35-day residential rehab, because they're being unplugged from that addictive behavior, that is also therapeutic in itself.
Well, what we know about addictive behavior is there's withdrawal. So what kind of symptoms did your patient experience, and would you consider that typical?
Depressive symptoms, anxiety, frustration, arguing a lot, and also craving. Craving is a huge one. And like I said, he shared that his craving for the device was greater than his craving for alcohol, which was actually an eye-opener for us.
Do you think that internet addiction could really just be maybe a sign of something else, like perhaps obsessive compulsive behavior, but instead of washing hands, you're tapping your Google Glass all the time?
That's a great question. And the research shows that addictive behaviors often co-occur with mental disorders and also co-occur with other addictions. So when you have somebody who abuses alcohol, who is also OCD, do you say they're OCD because they're using alcohol too much? No, you say they're OCD with alcohol problem or maybe alcoholism. So it took 30 to 40 years for alcoholism to be an entity by itself. I think internet addiction disorder, as we understand this with more research, it's going to evolve into its own diagnoses.
Are you doing more research on there? Are sort of the mental health community and addiction people, are they focusing on this now?
Absolutely, and that's why the Navy has me working on this problem, because we want to increase force readiness and we want to improve the lives of our service members. And so we don't want people to be stuck in addictive behaviors that now jeopardize their work performance as well as their ability to feel healthy. And so that's why we're doing this research.
What other kind of addictions do you think could maybe come about or emerge as our technology keeps growing?
You know, I think pornography is going to be a huge one. Pornography is very stimulating, and we're now having problems people coming in with erectile dysfunction because of pornography overuse, and also internet gaming disorder. We're having people coming in with problems because they're playing games 30 to 60 hours a day, 30 to 60 hours a week on top of their full-time job. So it's causing sleep deprivation, anxiety, lack of focus, and poor work performance.
Well, very interesting. I'm sure we'll be talking to you more about this in the future. Dr. Andrew Doan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Judy Woodruff. On the next News Hour, we head to Kentucky for one of the most closely watched Senate races in the country. That's Monday, Election Eve, on the PBS News Hour.
Sierra Club says 2014 was a good year for California's environment. The group just released its annual legislative report card rating state lawmakers based on how they voted on environmental bills, including the state ban on plastic bags and regulations on groundwater.
Right now, I think we've come through a fairly dark period for the environment in California, for environmental policy that was influenced in part by everybody's concern about the bad economy, and legislators were grasping at anything.
The ratings for San Diego County fell along party lines, with no Republican scoring above 27%. Democrats scored 82% and above, and Assembly Speaker Tony Atkins got 100%. City of San Diego began mandatory drought level 2 restrictions over the weekend. Tomorrow, KPBS Midday will bring you the specifics of those restrictions and what we want to hear how San Diegans are cutting back on their water use. You can share your water saving tips by calling into the show at noon on Tuesday or by going to our website, kpbs.org. Some San Diego doctors and dentists are offering cash for candy, $1 a pound, in fact. The annual candy buyback started today. The sweets will be sent to U.S. troops overseas. Check out our website at kpbs.org to learn where you can turn in any extra candy. Last year, they collected 9,000 pounds. Wow. Well, it'll be a nice day for voters to head to the polls tomorrow. Sunny along the coast with temperatures in the upper 70s, and it will start getting warmer as we head towards midweek. Inland Valley temperatures in the low 80s tomorrow, moving up to the low 90s by Thursday. And a fire weather watch will go into effect for the valleys and mountains by midweek. Low 60s in the mountain areas tomorrow, then going back up to the low 70s toward the end of the week. Desert temperatures will go from the upper 70s to the mid 80s. Let's recap our top story. Republican congressional candidate Carl DeMaio is blaming his opponent for the latest sexual harassment claims made by a former DeMaio campaign staffer. Justin Harper came forward to KPBS over the weekend saying he quit the campaign and moved out of state after an incident in a bathroom. DeMaio says the story is part of a smear campaign by Democratic incumbent Scott Peters.
At every turn, Scott Peters has been caught promoting, orchestrating, and coordinating this nasty, false, despicable smears against me.
Scott Peters held a news conference as well today and says his campaign had nothing to do with the accusations. Of course, we have the full story on our website, kpbs.org. You can also find all of our election coverage online at kpbs.org/election. You'll also find our reporting on all the big issues in tomorrow's election and our online voters guide. Of course, the polls will be open tomorrow from 7 in the morning until 8 in the evening. And when the polls do close, join us for the results on KPBS radio and right here on television. We'll have updates on the returns from 8 until 11 tomorrow night, and then analysis and reactions from the campaigns beginning at 11 o'clock Tuesday night. You can find tonight's interviews and all of our other stories at kpbs.org/evening edition. Thanks for joining us. Have a good night.